the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen and conductor Paavo Järvi, musical allies on a mission to create a new Beethoven. They want their version of the Beethoven symphonies to suit the 21st century. They call it the Beethoven Project.
Why another cycle? Who needs another cycle? We will always need another cycle of Beethoven symphonies. Beethoven symphonies are like symphonies of Mahler and Schumann and Brahms and so on. They live now, just as they lived when the composer wrote them, and they will live 100 years from now. What's different is that environment is different. We are living in a different world now than Beethoven lived in. There was no YouTube, there was no iTunes, there was no computers. It was an entirely different world.
The northern German city of Bremen, once a Hanseatic trading center and still a place that's both down-to-earth and cosmopolitan. From its base here, the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen is conquering the musical world with its outstanding interpretations of Beethoven. Paavo Järvi has been the orchestra's artistic director since 2004. Under his leadership, almost anything seems possible. Concerts are sold out, and there have been hugely successful world tours and highly acclaimed recordings.
In the morning, before rehearsal, the morning is not my time really, so the ritual is to somehow get out of the bed and make the rehearsal on time. What often happens in our life is that the evenings are the main time after the concert, where you feel completely alive. But somewhere you have to then pay back. And usually for me the mornings are not the best time.
It's the first day of rehearsals for the Beethoven Symphony cycle. Both orchestra and conductor start from first principles, even though they have performed these works before. In 3 months' time, they will perform all 9 symphonies in just 4 days at the Beethovenfest in Bonn.
First symphony for me lives well if it has enough charm, if it has enough light, if it has enough humor, if it doesn't sound like hard work.
Yeah, it's maybe a little faster. Let's take a little bit faster tempo here. Just tiny bit more. Fourth bar, and from the C sharp, G sharp. Let's make a real piano, and then so that it's not that is not stressed. Yeah, just a little bit more cantabile. And that's great. That's exactly what I wanted. Now let's take the fourth bar, bar number 4. And bravo.
If you start thinking of Beethoven, one thing that doesn't come to mind is sense of humor. Beethoven and humor somehow doesn't seem to be fitting in the same sentence. The truth is that Beethoven in his own way could be very funny. And especially the early music, the music of the younger Beethoven, can have very charming, very humorous, and quite surprisingly human moments in it.
And yum, ba-dum, yadum, bravo. This make really soft, la 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 pa pa, and really, and then the next one inaudible. So let's take it one time. And yum, body.
This is a key passage for us in the first violins. We need to have an especially good lead from the conductor, and the chemistry has to be very good. It has to be right. It's really down to his mood whether this passage works well or not. There are 7 of us playing it, and the dynamic is pianissimo. And then you have this rising scale, which goes a bit higher each time. And eventually it leads to the molto vivace, a really fast and furious final movement. We are really naked and on our own there, so it's tricky every time.
When I met them and I heard them play Beethoven, it became clear that this sounds how I want it to sound. Our views on how things should sound in Beethoven symphonies coincided. And the willingness to go deeper and find the little details and obsess on every detail, which I love about this orchestra because they are obsessive, like I am.
Osterholz-Teneva, a neighborhood on the edge of Bremen with its share of social problems. The high school here has 1,200 students. It's the biggest school in the city. Since 2007, it has also been the home base of the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie. Their concert and rehearsal room is inside the school building. School and orchestra are much more than mere neighbors. They're members of a living musical partnership. It's an unusual place for musicians to work, but then the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie is unusual. A former student orchestra that has played its way to the top. In 1980, music students in Frankfurt founded the chamber orchestra of the Junge Deutsche Philharmonie. Originally, it was a purely string ensemble. In 1992, the orchestra moved to Bremen, and from then on called itself the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen. Today, the orchestra has 39 permanent members. They don't just play the instruments, they're also shareholders in the company that operates the orchestra. They're intimately involved with the business side of it and regularly hold discussions with the management team.
When they got together almost 30 years ago, the musicians wanted to be as free as possible in their choice of programs and in how they developed the orchestra. That's why they chose what is in fact the riskiest legal form for the business, namely a partnership. That means that each member would have to pay off the entire debt, if it came to that, not just a part of it. Each member is responsible for the whole.
We wanted to decide who conducts us and whether we want a conductor at all, whether we want wind instruments, how we work.
I can't always get my ideas through. Any proposal has to be voted on by the whole orchestra. But at least I can be sure my views are listened to.
The orchestra earns around 60% of its income through its activities, without support from the state. It's an unusually high proportion for a German orchestra, and it means they always face a degree of risk.
When times are tough, that is very evident. If we are playing to empty halls, and we know that our next paycheck will be directly affected by that, it's a real worry.
Second symphony is a continuation of the classical symphony, but already you have a sense that he's going somewhere else. It sounds to me almost as if the idea of a classical symphony has become slightly small to him. He needs to get out of that box. Nice.
That's the theme from the trio in the scherzo movement. A trio is typically played by just a few instruments. It's usually the woodwind who introduced the tune. In this case, it's the oboe. It's a soft theme, so that's why I've put a circle around the piano in my music. Paavo Järvi was very insistent that we should take the piano seriously and that we should not begin the crescendo too soon, so that there's a clear accent.
I was thinking that maybe we can experiment a little bit. He writes a sforzato where he writes it, yeah? But in the first time, maybe we should exaggerate the lack of sforzato. So it's a becomes a bit too much the same thing, yeah? One and actually. Yes. So there is a little bit more contrast between these two sides. Let's finale, please. When you look at the last movement, for example, you realize that there is a kind of a rhythmical figure which already is quite telling about what's coming in the future symphonies. It's a kind of a humor that is already starting to be a little bit obsessive, slightly mad.
I'm not sure when we got to know Paavo. I think it was about 12 years ago, maybe a bit longer. It was obvious that he had a similar musical language to ours.
Under Paavo Järvi, we are having our most beautiful and our most fruitful period.
He's a great humanist. He once told me that more than anything, he loves working with people.
I think Paavo Järvi has made the optimal use of the strengths of this orchestra, of our musical language. He can use that to make music with us in his way.
He's the kind of guy who can turn up and somehow focus all the energy the orchestra has. Sometimes it's a bit...
Paavo Järvi was born in 1962 in Estonia, then part of the Soviet Union. His father, Neeme Järvi, is an internationally successful conductor. In 1980, the Järvi family emigrated to the United States for political reasons.
In a strange way, it does remind me of an old town in Estonia. Estonia they're both Hansa towns, the Hansa cities, and there is something that feels familiar. It's not exactly the same, of course, and you will never find a building like this in Estonia. But there is something Nordic about this environment here, and it feels familiar, yes.
What links Paavo Järvi with Bremen is above all his work with the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie. He's also chief conductor of 3 other orchestras: the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra in the United States, the HR Sinfonie Orchester in Frankfurt, and the Orchestre de Paris.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a traveling circus. It's not so unstructured as it may look. In fact, I live purely on schedules. And to me, I'm so used to relying on the schedule that if I go home and I have a week off and I don't have a schedule, I almost feel panicky because I don't know what I'm going to do. What time should I go somewhere?
Paavo Järvi's home is in Cincinnati, Ohio, but his wife and his 2 children don't get to see him all that often. His travels take him around the world for about 240 days a year. It's a life spent in airports and hotel rooms, as well as on the rostrum.
Let's see who writes to me.
In my life, that's my connection to my friends. I talk to my children on Skype. It's just my lifeline. Without a computer, without a BlackBerry, without mobile phones, I can't imagine how people lived before. I like listening to music as a relaxation. Music's a hobby. Actually, music is a hobby number 1 and then profession. For me, it's much more fun to listen to it. I love conducting it, but to me, the joy of listening to something that you don't know for the first time is fantastic. This is real fun. Well, the Third Symphony is the first truly revolutionary symphony. It's a truly great. It is, I think, one of the greatest symphonies ever written in any time. Something that you don't expect, especially after hearing the Second Symphony and the First Symphony. Eroica comes as a completely new idea.
Yeah, it's amazing how ingrained it is the traditional way of seeing this. I think. Let's keep the march.
And the funeral march in Beethoven's Eroica is a march that, because of the controversy with metronome markings, has been often misunderstood, because every great symphony had to have a slow movement, or so everybody thought. And that funeral march, therefore, was taken twice as slowly, because it had to be that profound center of the symphony. When you look at Beethoven's markings, the funeral march actually is a very steady march tempo, slow, but still a march. It's a kind of a military funeral.
Die Lautstärke-Angaben sind Piano, Pianissimo, sehr leise.
The dynamic markings are piano, pianissimo, very quiet. But I always play this passage at least one notch louder so that you can hear the drumming sound, so that it's clear that it's not just timpani, it's a funeral drum accompanying a funeral procession. A normal orchestral piano would be like this.
In einer bestimmten Lautstärke Piano wäre wirklich so, was man grundsätzlich spielt im Orchester.
But I play this.
When we started exploring the symphony together, the traditional wisdom always say that keep the timpani quiet, make sure it's not too loud, make sure that it doesn't bother anybody. You know, for us, I said no, make it into a solo.
Beim Schluss hört man irgendwie,
At the end, it's only a forte, but it really ought to sound mighty. It has to sound convincing. It has to create this rhythmical effect of the triplet so that it sounds final.
der Darm, dass es einen Abschluss bildet.
Beethoven Orchestra was considerably smaller than we are used to hearing it. What happens when the proportions are right, you hear every detail better. You hear all the things that sometimes in a score you simply can't hear if there are too many strings for winds and so on. So the proportions are important. It also has a different feel to it because the smaller group can feel more like a chamber group, like a quartet.
The sound of the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie is determined both by its size and by the instruments the musicians play. Some of them, including the timpani, are historical instruments.
Das sind kleine Dresdner Barock.
These are small Dresden Baroque timpani.
Einfach von den Maßen.
They are smaller than normal symphonic timpani.
Normale symphonische Pauken hat man eine zentrale Stimmung.
They're tuned centrally. That means that when I turn this handle, I can tune the whole group. So I can tune them more quickly and with greater accuracy. And you hear the individual pitch more clearly.
Den einzelnen Ton wirklich auch klarer.
The Beethoven Project continues. Coming up in Part 2, viola player Friederike Latzko gets school kids excited about classical music. Paavo Järvi and his vision of Beethoven's music.
It's not pa 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 pa. It's ya pa pa pa. Ya ta ta tam.
And oboist Ulrich König relaxes between rehearsals in the next part of the Beethoven Project.